All right, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Iñaki Herrero. I'm the Managing Director for Energy Plus in the US, and I'm excited to present our webinar on PV modeling, a 10-year review. Before we dive in, let me cover a couple of housekeeping items. We will go for about 45 minutes, and we'll have time for questions at the end. You can go ahead and type any questions in the chat at any time. Let me start by introducing our team of presenters. As I said, I'm Iñaki Herrero. I'm the Managing Director for Energies in North America. I lead the team, and I will be kicking things off with some overview of our company and some industry context. We have Brian Custodio, Director of Data Science and Consulting, who will walk us through some of the more technical shifts in energy modeling approaches over the past 10 years. Daniel Koerber, Senior Manager for Consulting, who brings over a decade of experience in energy modeling. And Priscilla Bell, our Data Science Specialist, who has been leading our efforts in modeling PV plus storage systems. At Energies, we wanted to do this webinar as a way to look ourselves in the mirror after 10 years and thousands of energy yield assessments. See what has worked and what has not, so we could share it with the industry and collectively make it better. We will start with a brief intro to our company and then talk about how the renewable energy industry has evolved over the past decade. We will highlight key modeling techniques that have emerged during this time and wrap up with lessons learned from our team at a look at our ongoing validation efforts. Just a little bit about Energy Plus. We are a full-service consulting and engineering firm for renewable energy projects. Our services include independent and honest engineering, vendor inspection, conceptual designs, testing, and data analytics. We are part of the A+ Group, which is one of the world's leading testing, inspection, and certification companies, with over 25,000 employees in 70 countries. Our company brings 20 years of experience and a global track record of over 850 gigawatts and 100 gigawatt hours of storage. Okay, so the PV market in the US over the past decade, what has really changed? The scale has exploded. The utility scale PV fleet grew from about 10 gigawatts in 2013 to over 200 by the end of 2024. A 20 times increase and still adding over 20 gigawatts per year. Solar dominates new capacity additions. It delivered almost 50% of all US capacity additions in 2022, 55% in 2023, and over 60% in 2024. Construction costs went down and PPA prices followed. The median installed capex dropped by 65% since 2014 to about $1 per watt DC. LCOE is also down 65% from 2014 to about $50 per megawatt hour, and this is on average and without considering tax credits. PPA prices also fell significantly until 2019, and after that they have gone up a little bit due to high interest rates, high demand, and supply constraints. Trackers are the default design option, with over 90% of new solar capacity being trackers. The model technology has changed. We went from 300-watt monofacial modules to larger 700-watt higher efficiency PERC and N-type bifacial modules. Plants are now much bigger and the situation ratio is higher. The typical utility scale project grew from 20 or 50 megawatts to 200, 400, with some projects being close to 1 gigawatt today. Storage is becoming the norm. A big portion of the terawatt of solar projects in the interconnection queues are PV plus battery hybrids. And solar has also expanded nationwide. In the early 2010s, solar was built almost entirely in the Southwest, and today projects span across pretty much every region, with Texas, the Southeast, and the Midwest leading recent growth. On the flip side, the changes to the IRA and the tariff changes are making everyone's work incredibly challenging. And grid interconnection is the new bottleneck. Apart from those changes in regulation, these interconnection queues are giving headaches to everybody. There are massive queue backlogs, and the time from interconnection application to COD can be up to 5 years, where it used to be 3. All right, that's it for the market. I'm going to hand it over to Brian to get into PV modeling specifics. So Brian, if you want to share.
All right. Hello, everyone. Brian here. Thanks, Iñaki. All right. So Inertis refers to PV modeling in terms of methodology, procedure, and results collectively as an energy yield assessment, or EYA. EYAs may be completed at various stages throughout project development life. It can be done in early greenfield stages to get a preliminary idea of potential yields. It could be done just prior to construction when the design is more or less finalized, and it could be done post-construction when the project is already operating. Accurate EYAs determine a project's financial viability and ensure they can meet the revenue targets. Although all EYAs start with having an accurate solar resource. The inputs that go into an EYA include site-specific metadata, your major equipment, like your modules, inverters, and racking, your design specs, including the string size, the row spacing, the tilt and or tracking range, and your azimuth, your solar resource comparisons that lead to a single TMY selection, topography, and your wind-stow loss calculations. Note that there are many other inputs that go into putting together an accurate EYA, but we have just opted to focus on solar resource selection, topography, and wind-stow loss due to their particular relevance to more recent projects. Okay, so here is what is typically shown on page 1 or 2 of a PV-SYS report. The project summary section along the top shows the previously discussed site metadata. The loss diagram shows the annual global horizontal irradiation, or GHI, at the top of the waterfall loss table. And right below the GHI is the global incident and collector plane. We refer to this as the plane of array irradiance gain. These are the primary PV-SYS parameters that are impacted by the solar resource selection. Other items that are impacted, arguably to a lesser extent, are irradiance and temperature losses. All right, so the solar resources shown here are considered our trusted databases. These resources have been validated via comparisons to ground measure data and other available solar resources. Note that CPR, Clean Power Research 4.0, has just been released and is still pending review. We typically take the 2 most recent CPR versions, 2 versions from 3-tier Vaisala, based on the closest minimum measured bias, and Solcast. All right, so our solar resource selection process is as follows. Step 1, download data from all solar resources and aggregate on an annual basis. Step 2, compare each solar resource with assigned weights to different meteorological variables. Remove the outliers by using monthly plots and PV-SYS's clearness index. And finally, use engineering judgment to make our final solar resource selection. Moving on to site topography. So more than 10 years ago, all ground mount projects were modeled flat, regardless of terrain. We've developed a procedure that will at the very least account for some degree of existing topography. Certain sites will have undulating ground, hills, and valleys, which are more likely to occur on larger projects that cover huge swaths of land. We utilize United States Geological Survey data, or USGS data, at 1/3 arc-second resolution. We use QGIS, which is an open source software, to convert USGS raster images to a 3D point layer in a CSV format with 3 X, Y, Z columns. Upon importing this CSV file into PV-SYS, you see a mesh similar to the blue image in the bottom right corner of this slide. What are the impacts of accounting for topography? Typically, we would see increased near shading and electrical shading losses, which are highlighted here, and different plane of array irradiance gain values. Note that the gain will increase if the topography slopes toward the south, and it will decrease if the topography slopes toward the north. This is valid for projects in the northern hemisphere. It would be the opposite if the projects are in the southern hemisphere. The upper right image on this slide shows the POA gain once again, in addition to the near shadings and electrical shadings losses on the PV-SYST waterfall table. Okay, for single axis trackers, upon importing the USGS data into PV-SYST, you would create your table zones as needed. Then, you would fill in each zone like you would normally. The filled-in tables will follow the natural curve of the imported topography. The image shown here, it shows how topography can cause shading on nearby tables. There are no other shading obstructions, but certain tables, the ones in yellow, are being shaded by tables directly to the south. The actual shading is the dark gray that shows up at the bottom of each yellow table. The shading loss on clear day curve at the bottom right shows how much actual overall shading is occurring over the course of a given day. This is selected in the day of year option right here. Here are various views of fixed tilt tables on USGS topography with the realistic render toggled on. The top figure is a view from south facing north. The middle figure is a view from west facing east. And this bottom figure is an isometric view. Note that the trees also follow the topography. Lastly, here is an example of trackers for a project with the realistic render toggled off. It is a semi-isometric view, and the white gaps in the mesh show where the relatively higher grade changes occur along the topography. So Energous A+ has compared its topography modeling approach to imported PV case files that already account for the site-graded topography. PV Case is a separate commercial software that some clients and developers use to create their engineering drawing packages. PV Case is good for bridging the gap between AutoCAD and PV-SYST. You can account for actual site grading in your AutoCAD file, port it to PV Case, and have PV Case export a PV-SYST friendly version. PV Case files can also include tree lines. But note, PV Case files are not always available, and it just depends on the client. In our validation study, we compared USGS data to PV Case data for 5 projects, in which we had the PV Case files available. You can see 4 single-axis tracker projects and 1 fixed-tilt project across projects that range in size from 4.5 megawatts up to 29.5 megawatts. The resulting annual average production difference was less than 0.1%. This leads us to believe that our USGS-based approach is viable. The last major input we'd like to discuss is wind stow loss. Single-axis trackers increase yields for many developers, but it comes with a different set of issues. Wind stow loss is one such thing to consider, and it occurs when trackers are automatically tilted into a specified position to protect the structures from high winds. This is often an angle close to, if not exactly 0 degrees, but it varies based on the location. Our method calculates wind stow loss outside of PV-SYST, but it requires PV-SYST to complete. And note that we came up with our method before PV-SYST released its own version of a wind stow loss. Inputs include the aforementioned TMY file and a corresponding long-term time series file, or LTTS file. The end result is a monthly wind stow loss profile that is added to a separate soiling loss profile in PV-SYST. So note that a separate soiling and snow, if applicable, loss calculation is completed for a given project. This is a separate topic that can have a webinar of its own and involves using daily precipitation and snow data from the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA. The monthly wind stow loss and soiling loss is added together into a single set of monthly inputs in PV-SYST. You can see that it shows up in the soiling loss factor on the waterfall table in the PV-SYST report. In our post-processed deliverable, a custom waterfall line item is generated that shows the wind stow loss separately. Typical annual average wind stow losses range from about 0.1 to 0.6%. And here is a brief summary of some lessons Inertis has learned since 2013. In 2013, Inertis primarily relied on one or two solar resources based on proximity to the site. These sources were either the National Solar Radiation Database, or NSRDB, or MEDIANORM, which is just an interpolated version of the NSRDB. Inertis has since started selecting a solar resource from a larger pool of databases after doing more intensive vetting of said databases. In 2013, Inertis modeled all ground mount systems as flat with no topography, like we mentioned earlier. Inertis has since implemented a method to incorporate the use of USGS or PV case files if they are available. This allows for more accurate shading losses and POA irradiance. In 2013, annual soiling losses were assumed based on region. Inertis is now using more robust soiling and snow methods using daily precipitation and snow data from NOAA. In 2013, availability was fixed at 99% across all project types, regardless of size. With the shift to single-axis trackers came the need to account for wind stow loss and to also adjust availability assumptions. Additionally, newer module technologies have led Inertis to account for losses due to light and elevated temperature-induced degradation, or LETID, and ultraviolet-induced degradation, or UVID. Lastly, sub-hourly clipping is also considered as a separate loss from standard clipping. Now we'll discuss a validation study that we've recently put together with the help of a few clients that have provided us with measured data. This study, and any resulting adjustments to our methodology, was only possible because of these strong client relationships. In total, we analyzed 112 projects totaling 650 megawatts DC across the United States. The tables here show the spread of projects, with the majority being within the 1 to 10 megawatt DC range. Separately, note that a large number of these projects were concentrated in the region we label as East, with a sprinkling of projects across the remaining regions. Our validation study focused on four main metrics. We have the forecast performance ratio, or FPR, which is modeled P50, modeled PV-SYST P50 production, divided by actual measured production, unavailability loss in terms of percentage, the POA ratio, which is your modeled P50 plane of array irradiance divided by your actual plane of array irradiance, and your expected performance ratio, or EPR. This is similar to FPR, with the only difference being that the modeled PV-SYST P50 production is corrected for actual weather. That is, P50 production is multiplied by the ratio of actual POA divided by P50 POA. The results are summarized in the table below here. Notable mentions include that the availability median was approximately 98.2%, which is equal to a 1.8% unavailability loss. The median FPR was 96.1%, while the median EPR was 101.4%. This means that pure P50 production was approximately 4% below actual production. But when you account for actual POA, the delta is 1.4% above actual production. This points to our general loss input assumptions being slightly conservative. The majority of the shortfall in FPR comes from the POA ratio, which had a median value of 95.8%. Lastly, the standard deviation values shown here are all within the uncertainty band we would expect to see within our own EYAs. And here are some of the lessons learned from that validation study. Inertis's availability assumption was updated to an approach based on system size and type, i.e. fixed tilt versus single axis trackers. Plane of array irradiance is typically overestimated, and Inertis is looking into ways to account for this. System performance modeling is slightly conservative, which compensates for some of the overestimation of POA. The figure shown here takes the figure from the previous slide and adds in our availability assumption update. That is, we recalculated the FPR bias with the new availability assumption. This resulted in a 0.8% increase in the FPR result, from 96.1% to almost 97%. Right here. As mentioned previously, Inertis is looking into ways to further reduce the bias and get that FPR as close to 100% as possible. Okay. In summary, Inertis A+ has adopted several methodology updates over the years to increase the accuracy of our EYAs. This includes a robust solar resource selection process, the inclusion of wind-stow loss, and accounting for site topography. Note that Inertis A+ has more than 15 years of expertise in performing these EYAs. We'll continue to drive to be as accurate as possible in performing said EYAs. The processes explained here have been developed across several years, refined via several feedback loops, and verified against real data. As new technologies come out and renewable energy evolves, Inertis will remain open to methodology updates, including accounting for losses we don't even know about yet, and potentially reducing losses with which we are being too conservative. And now we'll answer some of the questions that that have been placed in the chat. I'll pass the mic to Priscilla and Dan to ask and answer said questions.
Thank you so much, Brian. It's a super informative webinar, and I think very thorough in our methods, especially with resource selection and wind-stow. We do have a few popping up in the chat, so keep adding those in, and we'll just get started and start this discussion. So our first question has to do with the shading losses. What do we think is an acceptable inter-row shading loss? And this person has also added a bit about the accuracy of the tool in PV-SYS because they believe the losses are generally lower than what is actually seen on site. So I'm not sure if we've been able to validate near shading losses, but Dan, do you want to take that?
Sure. The first question is almost impossible to answer given how many variables go into the inter-row shading losses in the PV-SYS. You're constrained by land, you're constrained by trees that you may or may not be able to cut down or trim. You're constrained by backtracking angles for single axis tracker projects. So I would even hesitate to give a value there. And then for the second question, yeah, we do see occasionally that the PV-SYS model does not quite line up with what's been measured on site. Sometimes it comes up in a capacity test, sometimes it comes up in a project that is performing for we're conducting a performance study for an operating project. I would say on average, the PV-SYS is fairly good, but we do occasionally see projects where the near shading losses are definitely underestimated, and that may be due to the topography, the inaccurate tree line, inaccurate tree heights, or PV cyst itself. But it's something that we, of course, monitor via the capacity test and via continued monitoring during the operating period of the project.
Oh, hey, Dan,
Absolutely.
so to get just because it was a lot of good content there, would you say that in general, if you take a little bit more time in modeling the site, you may not see this issue of lower shading losses?
I mean, the more time you take, the more accurate the shade scene should be. But there are plenty of times where we do feel we have a quite an accurate shade scene, and then during the capacity test period, they'll say, hey, the site is shading during periods which PV says you're not shading. So we know that it's not perfect, and there can be edge cases, right where PV switches over from shading to not shading that don't quite match up with PV. But in general, the more time you spend in the shade scene, the more care you put in it, the more accurate your model to measure results should be.
Got it. Okay. Thank you. Really good question. Yeah.
Sticking with the shading questions, do you want to talk about how we model tree lines and forestry, as one person has put it?
Yeah. So it's a combination of resources. It may be site reconnaissance that clients have gone out, or we've gone out on site visits and taken photos, taken drone scans that can feed into our model. We use resources such as Google Earth as well. There's topographic data in the USGS database as well that can be accessed. So it's a combination of what information is available at the time. And we're always just striving to use that combination of the best resources to produce the most accurate tree line that we can.
Great. Why doesn't Energy use PVCase to model near shade scenes, and why do we do it in PV instead?
Well, as Brian touched on, we do use it when available. Sometimes just the information, the resources needed to produce a PVCase file just aren't there. And so we would then resort to using the USGS topographic data, which does not include site grading. So our preference is always to use the PVCase file that does include that site grading. So we will push clients to provide that where possible. And then if received, we will do a sanity check that the tree line, the tree heights, the sloping in the topographic mesh and whatnot seem reasonable. And if all that checks out, then we would use that as the shade scene for our EYA.
Absolutely. Okay, let's go to a bit of a topic change. Let's go to solar resource selection. Are ground-based measurements incorporated into our solar resource selection, as in tuned or bias-corrected data sets?
They can be, but in most cases they are not. That data would come from clients that have set up weather stations or met stations on site to collect data. We could perform an MCP analysis to measure, correlate, predict that would, in the end, produce a usable solar resource file that is tuned with the measured site conditions. We typically only see that for utility scale projects in which the economics make it worthwhile. And it can be tricky because you do want to capture the full seasonality of the year. And so if you collected a year of data and then due to data dropouts or just general data quality issues, you end up with less than a year, then we may not be able to use it for the exercise because we didn't end up capturing that full seasonality. So in most cases, we would encourage more than a year, and that may not be feasible due to timeline, to pricing and whatnot. So in short, we can use it. We have used it in the past. We performed those MCP analyses, but in most cases, we don't end up using that.
Got it. Why do we not include solar GIS in our trusted database sources?
Well, we found that the GHI tracks quite well with our other trusted sources, and those trusted sources are currently CPR 3.7, 3.8, Solcast, and then Vaisala, two data sets from Vaisala as well. And we found that the GHI from SolarJS tracks quite well with that, but when transposed in the POA, that the SolarJS POA tends to be typically about 2% higher than the average of the other trusted data sets. So we have opted to include it as a reference data set that may inform our overall decision, but wouldn't be a data set that we'd actually select for use in our EYA.
That makes sense. We have also got some questions about our validation study, so I think we'll pivot to talking about that. Seeing that our validation study showed a bias in the POA ratio, what are we doing to account for that? And maybe Brian can answer this question.
Yeah, this is a hot topic right now internally. We are talking to actual our data solar resource database providers as well about this. And one of the major things that we're considering is to actually change our transposition model. So currently Perez is the default. It has been the default since as far back as I can remember. And it's been mostly accurate, especially on clear days. It's very accurate on clear days. The problem with Perez arises on cloudy days. The diffuse conditions can really mess with the transposition. And so as a substitute, we are considering Hay-Davies, the Hay-Davies transposition model, which in our initial testing is showing on average about a 1 to 2% drop in plane of array irradiance compared to Perez transposition. We just haven't done enough validation of that quite yet to fully support a shift to Hay-Davies over Perez, but that is the one major thing that we are considering. Yeah.
So would you say that the main reason that we are seeing lower POA in actual measured data is due to cloudy days, or why do you think that the POA is lower in general?
I think it's a combination of factors. I don't think it's transposition model alone. Something that we don't really keep track, have a good sense of like records is how often do pyranometers and reference cells actually get cleaned on site once they're operating. Mm. We know that O&M contracts specify that typically every time that your O&M provider is on site, that they clean the sensors with a damp cloth. But usually that record is not tracked in a monthly O&M report. You don't usually see that as a note. Not often enough, I would say. There's that. So maybe it's 30 sensors that are underreporting POA. We also don't know how often these sensors actually get recalibrated once they're installed on site. You get really good calibration at the beginning because it's freshly installed. It's a brand new sensor, but are you actually going out there and recalibrating your sensor every 2 years, every 5 years? So there are other things I think that go into it.
Yeah. Specifically, have we seen this trend in more areas than others, or does it depend on any like ratio of direct to diffuse or any other site characteristics, or do we generally notice that the on-site POA is less than what PVSys is telling us kind of all over?
I want to say broadly speaking, it is generally lower, but I think what I've seen is that when you do have more clear sky days, that the plane of array irradiance is closer to PVSys. So, but again, just generally speaking, I wouldn't say across all projects it's like that. But yeah, I think our validation study, which we can send, by the way, shows which regions have better correlation with PV cyst.
Okay. Yeah, definitely reach out to us if you'd like to see that validation study. A couple of availability questions. I think it'd be good if we just stated our the results from that validation study and what we updated our availability assumptions to be.
Oh man, I don't remember off the top of my head. Let me see. Let me bring it up.
So I have them. So we are applying a lower availability in year one for system teething to get out the kinks of those kind of known first year issues that pop up for projects. And then year two onwards, we would apply our long-term availability. And that availability percentage for fixed cell systems would be 98.5%. And then for trackers would be 98 to 98.2, depending on system size.
Okay, thanks, Dan. I think there have been some interesting questions in here about the model and how it relates to financing. So one of our attendees has asked, how can we stop sponsors from pushing for aggressive modeling assumptions? Which I think is apt.
I think validation helps. Sometimes, I would say there are two types of situations when this happens. Sometimes a sponsor who has been developing a project or has acquired a project genuinely thinks that the production is going to be higher than what we are giving. And when that is the case and you have a solid validation data and you present those data, most times you can, let's say, convince the other part that what they're actually asking for is not going to happen. So I think that helps. There are other cases, many other cases where the sponsor will just they want to get more out of the financing. They will push us in order to use different assumptions and such. And I do think we do a pretty good job at pushing back, with validation, with our modeling book, which we use, and we usually don't deviate from that unless there is clearly something that we missed. There is a specification that was different than we model. So I think both validation and being strict in using the modeling assumptions that we're comfortable with are the way to go. But curious to hear Brian or Dan's opinion on that.
I think I can say this here. We have lost business because a sponsor has refused to use our assumptions. Because we stand our ground, we lose the contract to somebody else who is willing to take them on that. And so, yeah, I think I generally agree with what Iñaki's saying. We stand by our validation efforts. We always rely on data, measured data to support something. Any change that we make is going to be because we have the measured data to support it. And honestly, it's nice to see that some developers we've been partnering with for a few years have actually backed down eventually after seeing their projects go from development stage to operating, and they see that our original assumptions were actually, more accurate than what they wanted. So we've seen that change happen actively.
I don't have anything to
Anything to add, Dan?
No, they did great.
Okay. We have got a question about capacity tests, also kind of related to aggressive modeling choices. So this person has said the capacity tests are typically done by the project EPC as required by the contract to meet mechanical substantial completion and push the project to COD. The baseline PV-SYST model for the capacity test can often differ from the PV-SYST model performed by an IE. Does Enertis have any guidance for how to better align the, EPC PV-SYST and then the IE PV-SYST?
Brian or Iñaki, do you want to kick that one off?
Yeah, the best case scenario will be use the IE PV-SYST as the one to attach to the EPC agreement. Sometimes that is not possible. And as this person is saying, the EPC model is sandbagged, so it uses different losses, or it has a huge tolerance, which can work either way, can benefit one way or the other. So it's a tricky situation, in our opinion, and guys, keep me honest here. It would be best to use our model or the IE model always, so there is not a difference. And also use a reasonable, if any, uncertainty for the capacity test. But curious to hear the team's thoughts on this one.
Yeah, it depends on when we get brought in to do the review. If we're lucky enough to get in before the EPC agreement is executed, then absolutely we would recommend using our model or whoever the IE is on the project's model. But we would also note that the availability, so you have the IE model, and then you have your capacity test model. And the capacity test model should be the IE model, but with 100% availability. If there is a wash that's taking place before the capacity test, you would set the soiling to 0%. And that's usually negotiated in the deal as well. If there is no wash, sometimes what can happen is you have a soiling station on site, and you can calculate the actual soiling during the capacity test, and that value would replace the standard PVSys models soiling for that month. Those two values should absolutely be specified in the capacity test model. But yeah, if we happen to join in on a project after the EPC contract has already been executed, there's not much we can do contractually speaking, other than providing our opinion on how different is the EPC model from the IE model. I think generally speaking, developers should go into EPC contract negotiations with a set of assumptions that they are comfortable using, including the solar, everything that we just talked about, the solar resource, the wind stow loss, and all the losses you should have standardized going into your EPC contract negotiations, so that you have an idea of what is reasonable at a baseline. Even if there's no IE involved, every developer should have their own set of modeling assumptions set as a standard.
Sounds good.
So
Okay, sounds good. All right, I think this is also kind of a hot topic right now is hail and storm stow. We talked about wind stow, but how does Energous account for hail, stow, or other extreme climate events?
Yeah, so hail stow is not currently explicitly captured in our EYA. The wind stow feature that we are using, by nature of some of those hail events coming in storms that are above the wind stow threshold, it is partially captured, but not explicitly captured. And I believe we've discussed it internally, and Brian may be able to add some more color to that. But about adding it as a feature in future EYAs. But that's on the modeling side, and then there's on the risk assessment side for technical due diligence reports, where we will look at governmental data for various severe weather events, and that it's hailstorms, it's tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes, wildfires, and we will document that in the technical due diligence report, and we will identify what the risk associated with each of those, and flag that if something seems to be kind of out of the ordinary for the typical project, and to make sure that all parties involved that are reading the report are aware of what severe weather risks might occur at the site.
Yeah, and I can add on the hail modeling aspect. So we've discussed internally whether or not we should actually account for hail as a separate loss. We came to the conclusion that hail events themselves already occur on cloudy days, and at that they typically last for a few minutes at a time. And so to capture an actual hail event in a PV-SYS run, which is done at an hourly simulation, would be quite difficult to do. The fact that it's already on a cloudy day means you're maybe losing an hour of already pretty bad irradiance, so it's a low irradiance time period, and you're not going to experience that much loss. That's also a stow, so it's not like you're outputting zero production. You're going to be getting some production, and so we've decided for now that it's not enough. It's not enough production loss to move the needle. So that's why we don't do hail loss as a separate line item for now. And then for was it extreme weather? Was the other one, right? Climate change. Yeah, so this is an interesting one and something that we've also discussed. So inherently, as part of the TMY creation process, the reason you put together a TMY is to actually account for extreme weather events. So because otherwise you could just use an average year. And by average year, you could just like take all of the Januaries and take the average of every hour of every like January 1st, 8 a.m. You just have the average 8 a.m. timestamp. But what is actually in the TMY is an actual 8 a.m. time period from like 2001 or 2010. And the way that TMYs are constructed is you're taking a period of time that actually happened over a 20 to 25 year period instead of an average. So by taking an actual time period, you're trying to capture those moments, those storms, those extreme weather events, instead of an average. So inherently, the TMI creation process accounts for that. And with every year, like every calendar year, you get more data to add to that TMI selection. And so in theory, as you get more years, you account for more climate changes. And that is the current school of thought internally. So until there's something else, that is our current process. I should also note that the more years you have in a pool for a TMI creation, the lower the uncertainty, and the lower the interannual variability.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Brian. I think this would also be a good time to touch on why we don't use the PV-Syst Winstow, and instead we do it outside of PV-Syst. Dan, you want to take that?
Yeah, and Brian touched on this when he talked about the Winstow feature earlier in the slide deck. We actually developed our procedure before PV-Syst had this as an option, and so we've been doing it outside of PV-Syst and applying a Winstow correction to the monthly soiling losses to attempt to capture the seasonality. But as to why we don't currently do it in PV-Syst, I believe PV-Syst is still limiting you to a single stow angle in PV-Syst 8. And we know that some trackers stow at non-zero angles. And so you'd have to account for, whether it's negative 52, positive 52 as the stow angles. It becomes more tedious to run multiple simulations there. And so we end up applying it outside, doing the calculation outside of PV-Syst, and then adding in that seasonality to the monthly soiling losses.
I think PV-Syst also doesn't give you a separate line item. I think it gives you production that already has Winstow, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So you lack visibility in the waterfall table that we present in our deliverables to clients. Our deliverable would include that Winstow loss line, whereas PV-Syst does not break that out separately.
Great. Moving on to uncertainty, do you want to talk a bit, Dan, about how do we calculate our P99 value for the first year, and then also how we calculate the 10-year P99?
Yeah, so we assume a normal distribution in which there are 4 uncertainty inputs. There's the database uncertainty, which would come from CPR, Vaisala. Then there's the transposition model uncertainty. There's some uncertainty going from GHI to POA. And then we have the interannual variability, which will vary from site to site, and that will be based on the long-term time series. And the 4th component is the energy model uncertainty. That was based on the uncertainty for the various inputs that go into an EYA. And those are the four core uncertainties that go into our overall uncertainty. And then the only difference between a 1 year and a 10-year uncertainty would be that the IAV, interannual variability, we would use a long-term, we would assume that the IAV has approached the long-term behavior over a 10-year period. And so you would see a slightly lower IAV component. And so you'd also see a slightly lower overall 10-year project standard deviation.
Just divided by the square root of 10. You take the IAV and you divide it by the square root of 10, I believe.
Yeah, that's how we do it. Thanks, Dan. Back to talking about trackers. Do we have any changes to our modeling when we are modeling a terrain following tracker?
Yes, it's done in conjunction with coordination with the tracker manufacturer. For example, something like the services that the next tracker might offer. We've worked with them in the past for their different algorithms that they have two different algorithms that differ from how PVSys is assuming a typical tracker would behave. So we have worked with them in the past to adjust our models to more closely match what the expected field behavior is. So I may have misunderstood the question and answered a different question. So
do you want me to repeat it?
Let me see. What if any changes? So if by terrain following they do mean something offered a specific product offered by that tracker manufacturer, then we would work with the tracker manufacturer first to validate their overall process, to validate that to get coordinate with them to confirm that both they and we are comfortable with any inputs that are coming from them. They're comfortable with how we're using any data they provide us in our model, and then we would incorporate that into PVSys, and there are a variety of methods depending on exactly what algorithm might be used. Brian, do you have anything to add?
No, I think you touched on it all. We just work with them to make sure that we get it accurately done.
Yeah. Okay, something also related to validation, but on the soiling side. So has Enertis done any analysis specifically on soiling loss accuracy, especially in high soiling regions such as the Central Valley in California?
We haven't been able to do any direct validation studies, as in measured data to do the validation study itself. We've only ever done daily soiling rate validation, as in the data that we do have from projects. They're not in a specific region, but we try to use that data to validate our existing daily soiling rate assumptions. If people are willing to share that data, Phil, then we could do that, just like we did with availability.
Sorry to interrupt. So we actually have done it by measuring IV curves of clean and soil modules on a number of regions, and this was done by our testing colleagues. We did a pretty extensive study. This was in the Atacama Desert in Chile. And we saw some interesting results. And also, I think in the Central Valley, I remember a big project where we were working on a few years back with soiling stations. And the soiling stations that Brian was talking about earlier on when you are doing capacity testing. The results were a little bit inconclusive. So we were not very happy with those. And in the end, I think we weren't able to use the data from the soiling stations. But I think that will fall into the category of validating soiling losses here. We do think, in general, our soiling losses are a little bit conservative. and we do think that maybe part of that is EPA, part of that being conservative is due to soil losses. But as Brian says, we're still a long way to go into figuring out if that's actually the case. And then
Yeah,
it's worth mentioning, Brian, what happened in the Carolinas with pollen and soiling.
I was about to say. Yeah, so the Atacama Desert one was one that I was thinking of, but it was used to, that one pretty much supported our daily swimming rate assumption that we currently use and actually showed that a higher daily swimming rate isn't necessarily correlated with a more arid region, like a more desertic climate, let's say. But then, yeah, on the flip side, I think in the Carolinas, we've seen that our daily swimming rate assumption that we've been using, which is typically around 0.1% or 0.125%, may not be enough because of the sticky pollen that can occur during spring when all the flowers are growing and all the pollen's in the air. That pollen sticks to modules, and a typical rainfall event doesn't necessarily clean the modules of it. And so I would say that, yeah, generally maybe we are a little conservative, but not in the Carolinas. And if anything, we might have been a little aggressive there in the past. But yeah, in those cases, we would consider a higher daily swimming rate today.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Priscilla, we are like
Yeah,
almost at time. I think just
I think
wanted
we've got
to,
like 2 minutes left.
yeah, yeah. Do you think we have time for one more question, or should we close it here and then respond to the questions via email?
I think we've got time for one more quick one.
Okay.
What's the best way to capture albedo measurements to compare modeling assumptions for bifaciality gains?
Mhm. I think
Yeah,
there is
Brian,
some. I think there's two things that are worth mentioning here. NREL has a sort of guidelines or recommendations on how to place back of the module sensors in order to best capture albedo. I do think, I'm speaking out of memory, I do think they recommend silicon sensors as opposed to pyranometers. We do have pyranometers and albedometers that we deploy on site to do this kind of measurements. And, depending on how you set the station, you will get slightly different results. But what we have seen is that bifaciality tends to differ more depending on the bifaciality factor of the modules, which you should test, than the actual albedo on site. So when you're buying the modules, ask your model vendor or a third party such as ourselves to do measurements of the bifaciality of your modules, because more times than not, that bifaciality factor is not what they're selling you. And because of that, the bifacial gains are not going to be the ones that were modeled in the study.
Yeah. I think that's all we have time for, but please email us with any more questions or if you want to set up a call to talk about modeling some more. We really enjoyed hosting this webinar and look forward to connecting with everybody.
Yeah, and just wanted to say we have another one coming up on the wind side for those of you who are interested in wind projects. It's on June 26th. It's called Closing the Gap, How to Reduce Deviation in Wind Energy Forecasting. And we will send in the invitation very, very shortly. So we hope to see you there as well. Thank you so much for attending this one.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.